use the chat function. Again, it's at the bottom of your screen. You can see in the toolbox to type in your questions and comments to the panelists. We will have a moderator reviewing the chat questions that come in, and at the appropriate time, the moderator will call on you to vocalize your question to the group. So if you're having any technical difficulties, you can send me a private chat or send a private chat to any co-host through the tool at the bottom of your screen. Okay, so without any further ado, I will turn it over to CEO Michael Maloney to give some introductory remarks.
Good morning, everybody, and a special welcome to those of you who are west of the Eastern time zone. I know it's pretty early, particularly for those of you in West Coast time. And it's great to see so many folks here this morning, 65 of us already. Really appreciate you joining us. I'm Michael Maloney, as Chief Executive Officer of the American Institute of Physics, and I think I've met, by scrolling through the screen, I think I've met very many of you already, so it's great to see you. It would have been even better to have you in person at ACP, but we are in extraordinary times, obviously, and so we were very happy to see so many of you joining us this morning. The Assembly is an important part of our annual program at AIP because it brings together the leaders of our member societies, our 10 member societies and 27 affiliated societies. And we're joined today also by special guests from across the nation. I know that in comparison to the challenges many of you are facing in your societies to conduct some very major meetings in the months ahead, to conduct those meetings now virtually or reschedule them. Those are very challenging circumstances for many of us, but in comparison, this meeting should be straightforward, but we seek your indulgence if we run into any technical challenges. As Liz mentioned, we have been trying to beta test a lot of the presentations today and such, so I think we're poised for success, but please be patient with us if we run into any technical challenges over the next couple of hours. Today I think we'll learn about how scientific societies can help drive culture change in our respective fields so that we can all better advance the essential goals that I know we all share in the areas of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. We're hoping that the discussions today will help your society, will help AIP, will help the physical sciences community to think how best to drive forward the conversation within your own communities. And then also, primarily, obviously, our goal is to lead efforts to achieve a welcoming environment for all. This annual meeting aligns perfectly with the goals of our recently adopted AIP strategic framework that I'm sure most, if not all of you, have heard me talk about since its adoption last September by the Board of Directors. At this Assembly, we advance the success of our member societies and drive future progress in the physical sciences through our discussions of topics that resonate across the Federation and the communities of practice that our members and affiliated societies serve. We hope that this Assembly demonstrates that AIP is a trusted source of information in dimensions such as the statistical research data that we gather and which informs so much of our collective discussions on diversity, for instance. And we also strive to be excellent in the hosting of these events, both in person and now as we try to do them virtually. So those are the four key pillars of our strategic framework about advancing the success of our members, about driving progress in the physical sciences, about being a trusted source of information, and about driving excellence. So as I just mentioned, this Assembly is a really important, or resonates importantly with all those goals. So today our discussions are going to start with some highlights from AIP's first expert report, which was released at the American Astronomical Society meeting in January of this year, and has been discussed at many of your board, council, and society meetings over the last 3 months or so. That report, The Time Is Now, Systemic Changes to Increase African Americans with Bachelor's Degrees in Physics and Astronomy, is the result of 2 years of work by the AIP Chartered Team Up Task Force, which was made up of distinguished leaders from across the community who are dedicated to the ideals of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And the report was also important in that it also drew from expertise in the social sciences, so that we could really understand the data that the Team Up Task Force gathered, and also use that data as the basis for the recommendations. So without further ado, I want to introduce Mary James, who will be chairing today's assembly discussions. She was the co-chair of the AIP Team Up Task Force. I'm delighted to say that through this process, I think Mary, I now count as a good friend, and I've been really impressed with how dedicated she is to diversity of our communities. She is a Dean for Institutional Diversity at Reed College in Portland, Oregon, so one of our West Coast attendees today. So thanks, Mary, for being up so early on the West Coast. And she's also Chief Diversity Officer of the college. Mary has served as both a member and chair of the APS Committee on Minorities in Physics for 4 years, and was instrumental in launching APS's national mentoring community. She has vast experience with diversity and committee task groups, and is also a professor in the Department of Physics at Reed College, specializing in particle beam astrophysics, classical electrodynamics, and physics outreach. So Mary, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, and thanks for co-chairing today's session.
Thanks very much. So I just want to, first of all, just introduce the session and the framework of it, and then introduce our speakers today. So the session will begin with two talks. I'll give a brief talk, and then Ed Bershinger of MIT will give a brief talk. And I'll introduce those as they come. And then we'll have a question and answer period after the first 2 talks, so that assembly members can become involved in the conversation early. Then I'll introduce the next two speakers. They'll also give talks, and then we'll have a second Q&A. And you can ask questions at any time via the chat. And then Arlene Modesta Knowles, who's the Team Up project manager, will be monitoring those chats. And when we get to the question and answer periods, she will, so to speak, call on people. And at that time, we'll ask you to unmute to ask the question audibly that you put in, that you've typed in before. Okay, and then after the 4 speakers and the brief question and answer periods, we'll have a panel discussion and then a broader discussion with the entire assembly. There are 3 questions that we'd like you to have in your mind, thinking about as the presentations and question and answer periods come. And these are the 3 questions. What levers for change does your society have to enable culture change in your discipline? The second question, how could your society begin to pull these levers to address your diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging goals? And the third question, what successes have you already had that you might share with other assembly members so that your ideas that have been successful can be used by others to leverage change? Okay, and I get Liz already noted that all the speakers' talks are accessible via PDF through the Assembly website in case you want to refer to them after the talk. Okay, so I will then, I'm the first speaker. So Michael's already introduced me. Thank you so much, Michael. So I will attempt to, the American Institute of Physics commissioned the Team Up report. Go ahead and advance the slide. Prior to the study, using the AIP data, we came to understand the following things: that African American students are succeeding in college and earning degrees in other STEM majors at increasing rates. Yet their percentage of physics and astronomy BAs and bachelor's degrees has actually declined. And so our conclusion was that the relative lack of success of African American students in physics and astronomy suggests problems with the physics environment rather than a deficit in the students. And therefore, the best way to understand the problem is to study, and this is very important, to study the student experience from the student perspective. That is, what the students say about their experience is the data that we're interested in. Okay. Advance. So our guiding principles in undertaking this study was, first of all, that the students were at the center. So we were certainly interested in the departments and research labs in which they experienced in which they had their physics, and in classes in which they had their physics experience. But what we really wanted to do was keep them at the center of everything we did. The second is a strength-based approach, namely that we didn't want to see the students as weak and us as fixing them, but rather that the students have the capacity to do well and thrive in a physics program. And somehow the program itself and the environment they're in is letting them down. This study was focused on undergraduates, and I think we'll speak briefly about a similar study by the American Astronomical Society for graduate students. And then we embraced social science methods and perspectives. Okay, so advance the slide. Okay, so these are the research questions that we asked ourselves. How does the physics culture enhance or diminish African American student success? What are the influencing experiences? What factors lead to the persistence of African Americans obtaining bachelor's degrees in physics and astronomy? And what impedes or promotes the culture change in physics that would allow the students to be more successful? So the first three are directly related to the students, and the fourth is related to the environment in which the students find themselves. Okay, so we began in December of 2017, so this was a 2-year study. And the first thing was, as we said, a guiding principle was to ask the students to understand the student experience from the student perspective. And even among us, we kept going back to our days as undergraduates, and then we had to tell each other that's not relevant. What's relevant is the experience of students in 2019 and 2020. So we conducted a survey of over 230 physics students, about half of which were Black or Black mixed race. Then we surveyed 40 physics departments, most which had success in either moderate or good success in graduating students of African American students. Then in fall 2018 and spring 19, we conducted, actually it was 5 site visits to schools that had the highest success in graduating African American students. Some were HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. Others were predominantly or minority serving institutions, and others were predominantly white institutions. Then did data analysis and wrote the report, and now we're making the report, disseminating the report broadly. So the idea was, first of all, as I said, the student's experience is the data. Then we wanted to ask the question, what schools are most successful and what are they doing? And then we did an extensive literature review so that we weren't reinventing the wheel. Okay, advance. So there's the report, and we invite you all to read it. Advance. Okay, so I just want to go over the major findings of the report and some of the examples of recommendations. There are many more in the report, but we found that there were 5 factors that really affected students' ability to persist and finish bachelor's degrees in physics. The first is a sense of belonging. That is, the literature tells us for students to be successful, they have to feel that they're welcome members of the community. So here's a sample comment from a student in the written surveys. The climate of the physics department is very non-inclusive of people of color. They would say things like, you should change your major. So our findings were that fostering a sense of belonging is essential for African-American student persistence and success. What kinds of things can departments do? Departments being the major way in which students experience the physics community. Create a welcoming department climate. You're telling the students in every way you can, we're glad that you're here and we want to support your success. Department training and codes of conduct to minimize microaggressions, and training for faculty to foster a strong sense of belonging in African-American students. Advance. Okay. The next is physics identity. And this is the idea that students have to have a strong, to be able to perceive themselves and to be perceived by others, especially faculty, as future physicists and astronomers. So building a sense in them that they will eventually become the professionals that they see around them. So here's some data. I've had 2 professors ask me why I'm in physics. Why are you still a physics major? You're making your life difficult doing all this. And the student says, it's very discouraging when you hear this. So what kinds of things can departments do? It can invite experts in physics identity development to train faculty on evidence-based ways to strengthen students' sense of physics identity, including encouragement, recognition, and mentoring. And I'll particularly point out the third there, mentoring. The American Physical Society has a national mentoring community, and its goal is specifically to help professors become strong and effective mentors of students from minoritized groups. So those are the kinds of things that what we can do at the society level to promote this. Advance. Okay. Academic support. Clearly this is a cornerstone of getting a bachelor's degree. One has to do well academically. A student says, there was one teacher that really, honestly, I was going to give up on physics, and she changed everything. So the kinds of things that help students persist academically, effective teaching, clearly, multiple pathways to graduation. That is, if a student were to do poorly in an introductory calculus course in their very first term, do they still have a pathway through the major? And a strength-based approach to academic support are necessary. Strength-based approach meaning that you're working with the student with everything that they have, finding all the possible, finding any possible route for them. So if, for instance, if they stumble in one course, how can they make it up? How can they both work in the summer and take a course online perhaps to get that linear algebra course that they need? The other thing, so that's the multiple pathways into and through the major. Departments should regularly and quantitatively assess department recruitment activities and curricular pathways to identify points at which students leave before graduation and develop actionable plans to increase the persistence of students. Advance. Personal and financial support. So one of the things that was very, very clear in the study is that many African-American students struggle financially in college. So the continual stress of worrying about money to pay for school and the mounting debt cut across a number of the comments in our survey responses. and affected all aspects of students' lives, including dealing regularly with a lack of sleep. So the finding was many African-American students need support to offset financial burdens that create stress and impede academic progress. What are the recommendations? So this is something we don't normally think of as our responsibility in physics departments, but it should help students find on or off-campus paid internships or jobs related to their major, enabling students to earn needed income while supporting academic progress and that sense of physics or whatever discipline identity. So much better for a student to be working in a physics lab than to be working in a donut shop if their ultimate goal is to do physics. And then the department can identify campus resources for emergency financial aid, conference travel, and other unmet needs and help students take advantage of them. Factors for persistence. So leadership and structures. So basically, what are departments doing? What are the departments that are most successful at supporting African American students through graduation? What are they doing? They're very consciously establishing welcome and respectful learning environments, and they have an organizational structure to support that. So this is from one of the site visits. The Departmental Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee is responsible for maintaining a welcome and respectful learning environment. It organizes events in response to diversity equity issues when they arise. The takeaway here is that lone champions, that is one professor who's deeply committed to this, can make a big difference for students, but their efforts are ultimately unsustainable, making this an ineffective long-term strategy. In the most successful departments, a significant fraction of the faculty consistently value and support underrepresented students. So an example recommendation is that chairs can provide incentives and rewards to multiple faculty members, including those who are not members of marginalized groups, to actively support underrepresented students. So really, this is really saying that supporting students becomes part of the culture of the department rather than something that a few dedicated individuals undertake. So finally, the conclusion of the report is that the persistent underrepresentation of African-American students in physics and astronomy is due to the lack of supportive environment for these students in many departments and to the enormous financial challenges facing them and the programs that have consistently demonstrated the best practices in supporting their success. Solving these problems requires addressing systemic and cultural issues and creating a large-scale change management framework. And two of the following speakers will have more to say about systemic and cultural change and change management frameworks. So we'll hear a lot more about that this morning. I want to pause on this slide because I think it's really representative of the nature of the work of the task force. That is, you can see African-American students are centered here, and then who are the contributors to their success? Okay, that's my warning for myself. Individual faculty members certainly play a large role, but it's important that those faculty members' efforts are supported by departments, by the college and university, the professional societies, and private and public funding agencies. So all of these individuals and institutions have a role to play in the success of the students. Advance. So the process was that this is a member-driven and board-supported initiative, and the proposal was written and accepted by AIP. Task force members were selected for their expertise, their diverse identities, and their own personal experiences in the physics community. Our guiding principles were established, and then the focus was on evidence-based study using internal and external expertise and prior research literature. So one of the takeaways, you can advance, one of the takeaways here is physicists are not very used to using qualitative data, and qualitative data is really essential in an undertaking like this. So my takeaway would be that we can learn from our social science colleagues new forms of data that are useful to us in promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion in our community. Why don't we skip this one and just go to the final one? There's the task force. And I thank you for your attention. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce Ed Berschlinger. Ed is a professor at MIT in the physics department. He's an astronomer, astrophysicist, sorry. And he co-chaired the task force on the underrepresentation of African Americans in physics and astronomy. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Ed, and who's going to talk about the team up recommendations as they relate to culture change. So Ed?
Thank you very much, Mary. And thank you, Michael, for the introductions. Thank you, Liz, for all the logistics work in putting this together. And many thanks to everyone here. I am going to try to share my screen now. Let's see if this will work. So hopefully you see the first slide, systemic change, team up and beyond. Can someone confirm? Great, great. Well, as Mary said, the report was based on a student-centered approach and included perspectives from the social sciences. Those include a significant discussion about change management, culture, and society. And the reason for that is that the task force felt that a new level of thinking is required to solve a persistent problem. Underrepresentation of African Americans and the societal relationship, the problems of racism in our country are decades, if not centuries old. And so we need new ways to think about and to solve these problems. And that is the approach that we took here. So the Team Up report identified the structural and systemic causes explaining why African Americans have not experienced the growth in bachelor's degrees in physics the way they have in other fields, or as other minority groups have within physics over the past 2 decades. Solving these problems, we feel, requires changing not only the way physicists train students, as we emphasized in the student portion of the report, but how we think about training students. Research on change in higher education suggests the need for physicists and astronomers to recognize and to query the norms, values, and culture of their fields. The Team Up report, the Sea Change Initiative, and the new APS IDEA project all seek to stimulate and sustain a cultural transformation in the profession. I want to illustrate these points with a couple of quotes from African American students in the report, and they illustrate 2 key elements about physics culture and STEM culture in general: individualism and meritocracy. The first student said, "I wouldn't say people don't care, it's just that you could tell that people at predominantly white institutions are a lot more oriented on their own task. I don't say it's selfish, but they're a little more selfish toward their own goals." And the second, at community colleges, our curriculum is just to set us to go straight to, well, let's call it state university. You complete this session at our college and they just throw us in a pool at state. No representation, no study groups, nothing, just there by yourself. A lot of my friends that graduated ahead of me said they're either struggling or they're trying to survive. They have to come back to our college to seek help rather than seeking help at the state university. Now, it's been said that physics has a culture of no culture. That is, physics orthodoxy says that only measurable, quantitative, replicable quantities have objective meaning. This meaning is independent of the observer. Well, that's an incomplete description of the world. When it comes to the physics profession itself, this epistemology can be harmful because it blinds us to what is going on at times. As people, we obey the laws of sociology, not physics. Who studies physics, what they do, and how they do it are matters of culture, not physics. Paraphrasing Black feminist writer Audre Lorde, the physicist's tools will never dismantle the physicist's house. The Team Up findings and recommendations were organized by a set of factors. Mary discussed the first 5 factors centered within the departments, the institutions themselves. The 6th factor is concerning change management, and involves much more the relationships that Mary showed on the last slide, where the students were at the center, surrounded by the different levels and different players which affect them. And you may have noticed that my slides contain an Easter egg quote from some of my heroes and heroines, and there is Rosa Parks. Now, how does academia change? Recent reports have mentioned change management, and it's certainly a big topic within the Team Up report, also in some of the National Academies reports recently and others. And they do so because the report's authors recognize that until there's attention to the process of change, change either will not take place, it won't be sustainable, or both. Dr. Adriana Kezar of USC is one of the world's leading authorities on how colleges change. She literally wrote the book. She in her work described 6 so-called theories of change used in higher education. Now, there is terminology from the social sciences that is new to physicists. And I won't have time to explain it all, but I want to urge everyone on the call to recognize that there are important and valuable perspectives from the social sciences and a certain bit of lingo that we should become familiar with if we want to apply the expertise of our colleagues in the social sciences. I do want to mention one, which I've put here in the terminology of physics, although experts will know that first order and second order here are reversed from our usual concepts of phase transitions. First order change is relatively easy change in institutional systems. This is the approach where strategic planning works. In strategic planning, which all physicists are familiar with, there's broad agreement on the goals. We know that we want to diversify the faculty. We know that we want to build an experimental high energy physics group. Whatever it is, we have a broad understanding of what our aims are. We've got to do the strategic planning to figure out the course to that outcome. And there may be disagreements along the way, but broadly people are in step. They have a set of common norms and values and common assumptions about the goal. That's called first order change in the social sciences. Second order change is much harder. So here's where it's a little different from the phase transitions, because now there is a big latent energy involved in the transition. And here there may be actual disagreement about the outcomes, about norms and values, and indeed mismatch of culture. So when we talk about changing culture in physics, we have to recognize that the traditional strategic planning processes are perhaps not the best tools. They underlie a so-called theory of change introduced by Kezar called scientific management methods. And those are typically the way that physicists approach the topic. But what we've got to do is broaden our conception to allow us to think of other ways of categorizing the sociological systems that we're dealing with. And we can do that by learning theories of change from Dr. Kezar and others. As Mary mentioned, I served on the American Astronomical Society's task force on diversity and inclusion in astronomy graduate education. And a year ago, we released a report on diversity and inclusion for graduate students and do reference theories of change there. The Team Up report goes even more into the discussion of these topics because we think it's necessary for sustainable change. How do we accomplish this change? Well, in very, very brief terms, instead of a scientific and management or strategic planning approach, we think that successful culture change efforts involve considering other factors: culture, cognition, and even sociological power, social power within organizations. There are 2 key factors that Dr. Kezar's work has highlighted for culture change in the STEM professions, which we think will be helpful. The first is called sense making, defined as a learning process of creating meaning around concepts and ideas through a variety of social inputs, including dialogue with others. In fact, physicists will find this a very easily understandable process because it's what we do when we see data. We try to make sense of it and we discuss with one another. The important factor here is, as Mary said, that now we have to include other types of data, qualitative data, for example. Shared leadership is the name itself descriptive. Leadership of some process is shared by people in different positions, but the emphasis here is on combining top-down and bottom-up leadership for change. Many of us have seen that throughout society and even at our own institutions, students are calling for change. Student activism sometimes helps to propel change in our organizations. And there is evidence that when top leadership at the top and the bottom-up change agents work together, they can accelerate change. That involves using the so-called political theories of change, which recognize the role of social power and influence in coalition building. Shared leadership, by the way, is very closely related to participatory democracy, and therefore it relates directly to issues of equity because it ensures that the voices of those with lower social power are being heard and are part of the accountability mechanism. Therefore, this is a way of retaining student influence at the center. Here's a quote from the Team Up report, and I won't read it, but you'll see the emphasis highlights on systemic problems, systemic change, on norms, values, and culture of the profession. The AIP report, as I mentioned, is hardly unique in this way. Look at any of the recent NASEM reports on sexual harassment in the academy or on the recent report on mentoring, science of mentoring. You'll find discussions like this. And of course, this is a big focus as well of the AAAS Sea Change initiative, which is a movement towards institutional transformation and addressing systemic barriers. The Team Up recommendations under change management begin with this, directed to the professional societies. And there, right at the beginning, is this phrase, theory of change. So we're really encouraging all of you to do a little bit of study and reflection on these methods from the social sciences, which are discussed extensively in the Team Up report with links where you can learn more. And our later speaker, Dr. Susan Elrod, will be talking about how this works actually in practice. Another recommendation, 6C, is also directed to the professional societies, but specifically, they're the ways in which the professional societies can and do support physicists in the field. You all provide an incredibly important resource to the professional community. And one of the reasons we're appealing to you for help in this work is that what you do matters. You have influence, you can spread ideas, you can help us to create networks and advance the equity ideas of Team Up to spread more rapidly throughout the profession. One example of that in practice is the APS, American Physical Society Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity Alliance, or APS IDEA. This really is an outgrowth of the Team Up report because I had the privilege of writing the first draft of several of the sections of the Team Up report, including the change management section. And I was really motivated working with Monica Plish of the APS, Jeff Potvin of Florida International University, and others to put those ideas into practice. And this is a way in which recommendation 6C of the Team Up report.
2-minute warning, Ed.
Thank you, Mary. Now, before I end, I want to emphasize that this is not such an easy thing. We talk about cultural change a great deal, but it doesn't mean that as physicists, given our usual approach, we can just jump in and start changing things. People and organizations don't respond as simply as electrons do. And here's a quote from a really terrific report by Susan Elrod, and that should be Adriana Kizar, which you can download. A common mistake is to assume that well-intentioned faculty, especially those already in leadership roles, can manage such a team, that is a change team, without external and therefore independent and unbiased help. Teams that rush to action prematurely are forced to backtrack to develop relationships and understanding of why resistance develops among key institutional stakeholders. So my one recommendation to you is, well, the first one would be to read the Team Up report. But the second one is to study and implement shared leadership in your organization. Don't try to do it immediately across the field. Just look at your own organization and ask, how can you develop a change and assessment team that includes all the voices from bottom to top within the leadership of your professional society? So in conclusion, physicists cannot solve the discipline's equity problems using the traditional methods of physics or strategic planning, because the problem is it's not purely qualitative. It is qualitative, not quantitative. We can use qualitative and quantitative methods both. A successful culture change for equity, diversity, inclusion requires utilizing some new tools from social sciences. The Team Up report provides extensive recommendations and background for these. And finally, though I haven't talked about it, one of the lessons coming from the student movements is that social movements themselves are a promising means to foster change, and there are initiatives underway to take advantage of these. Thanks very much, and I'll leave this slide up for links to further information.
Thank you so much, Ed. So now we're going to have the first of our question and answer sessions. I'm going to put the timer on for this. So Arlene, can you take over here? And Ed and I are available to answer questions.
Sure. So there was a question from Amy Walker. Amy, I invite you to unmute and ask your question.
Thank you. So the Team Up study really focused on African American students. So I really wanted to ask, what do you feel are the similarities and differences for other URM groups? And also, since the study focused on physics, how do you feel there are similarities and differences between other science and engineering disciplines?
Ed, you want to start, or have me start?
Oh, why don't you start on that, Mary?
Okay, so one of the largest underrepresented minority group in the country, racial and ethnic group, is Latinas or Latinx. What the AIP data shows is that they're making steady progress so actually their percentage of representation at the bachelor's level in physics and astronomy is increasing. Whereas African-American students are decreasing, which is one of the reasons we focused on African-American students. I will say this, and I think it's important. Generally in diversity, equity, inclusion work, we believe in universalism. That is, that anything you do to make the environment better for whatever group you're focusing on, you're actually going to make it better for everyone. I learned this I remember as a graduate student, we had these exit interviews when I got my PhD, and they asked me what they could do to make the department more welcoming for women. And I told the chair a list of things, and he said, well, wouldn't these be good for the men? And I said, yeah, they would be great for the men. So yeah, does that answer? Ed, do you want to add here?
No, that was great, Mary, thanks.
Okay, great. So Paula asked a question, and I answered some of it in the chat, but I would invite you to voice your question, Paula.
Yes, my question dealt with astronomy versus physics. I know from my own department that astronomy is a much smaller group of people, and so it's much easier to make a welcoming environment with a small group than a larger group. So I was just wondering what the differences in the number of successes for, or non-success for astronomy versus physics was.
Well, maybe I'll take that one as an astrophysicist. First of all, you're right, astronomy is a much smaller profession. And it began with an even smaller fraction of African Americans 1 or 2 decades ago. More recently, astronomy has been making progress in representation of African Americans. It's come up to nearly the level of physics. So its growth rate is a little bit higher, although both are still low. One big difference with physics and astronomy is the percentage of women. It's something like 35% or maybe even 40% at the undergraduate level for women in astronomy, and it's also higher in the profession. I think that astronomy certainly has motivated my thinking about the power of organizing and shared leadership, because there has been a great deal of that exemplified in the discipline through a lot of efforts led by the AAS, which Meg Urey will be speaking about. But I guess the bottom line is, at the student side, astronomy still does have diversity challenges. We were unable to visit an astronomy-only department, but we did visit astronomy and physics departments, and we noticed there that indeed there are sometimes cultural differences across physics and astronomy, even within the same department.
Yeah, I guess I would add to that, one of our case study departments was a very large R1 that's doing a good job of graduating African-American students. And what was clear in that very large department was that this ethos that they saw as part of their the faculty, that part of their professional responsibilities were to create a welcoming and supportive climate for their undergraduates. And it really permeated the department. So it is certainly possible for larger departments this was a huge R1, at huge R1s, to create these kind of environments. But it was very interesting that it wasn't one or two people. It was really something that the department had cultivated, and they had been cultivating it for so long they couldn't quite describe. They didn't say, "Oh yeah, we remember that Tuesday 3 years ago when we decided to do this." They go, "Well, I don't know. We've been doing this. I don't know. We've been doing this for a long time." So it was really part of the department culture, is the best way to put it.
Great. All right. So Michael had a question. Michael, would you like to voice your question?
Sure. Thanks, Ed and Mary. Great presentations as usual. So I think as we've been disseminating the report, I think it's resonating. The message around the time is now to take action has been resonating with a lot of members of the community as we begin talking about it in various forums over the last couple of months. But I'm curious, Ed, and maybe Mary as well, but Ed, as you begin to talk to faculty about culture change, what elements of the culture change do you think resonates with faculty and they think, yes, we can do that? And what elements of culture change do they have more of a challenge sort of getting to grips with and thinking about? Because those are some of the topics I think that'll be really important for societies to try to challenge, to try and help faculty figure out the approaches to culture change and how they can actually engage in the kinds of change you're talking about.
Great, thank you very much for the question, Michael. To many physicists, culture change sounds a bit like fingernails screeching on a blackboard. Let's be real here. It requires a different way of thinking that we're not always comfortable with. And I think oftentimes the default is to try and turn it into a physics problem. Let's diagram it, let's look at the data, let's propose an experiment. That is to turn to the methods of physics. And so the challenge, one of the big challenges is to get physicists to slow down and realize that there are new data and tools required. Storytelling is a big part of that. It's a big part of the cultural theories of change that Dr. Kezar describes in her book. And that's not part of the practice of physics, except that it really is. So it really is. So I think one of the most successful ways is to get departments to look at their own data and struggle to make sense of it and realize that they have to hear perspectives that they're not normally used to.
Wonderful. All right, Jim Gates, please voice your question.
And I just want to say this will be the last question for this Q&A.
Oh, okay.
Great. Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, Arlene. I thought you were going to ask.
I'm happy to do that.
I have two questions that I have sent around, one to everyone and one to you. Let me ask the one that was directed to you. And because we can expand that. As the team up report was being formulated, I had this a conversation with another member in which they said that the University of Maryland, which was one of the institutions in the sample, had a subtle difference in its culture about this issue of diversity, inclusion, and excellence. And this particular person ascribed it to my having been on faculty there. And so my general question is, does faculty diversity, are there detectable things that are different for faculties where diversity has actually reached a higher stage of realization than not?
Let me take a first stab at this. I believe the answer is yes, Jim, absolutely. And although it's not in the Team Up report, I've been doing a mixed methods research study of MIT departments over a 50-year baseline to look exactly at the impact of faculty diversity and faculty leadership on student outcomes in the department. And it's become very clear in a number of departments that the champions, who may be the African-American faculty member in the department or another highly dedicated person, it could be a woman, could be a white male even, they make a difference, provided that there is support from the chair. So yes, absolutely, the faculty diversity matters. And although it wasn't the focus of our report, we think that it has to change along with other leadership efforts to effect culture change in the departments.
Yeah, I guess I would just add that's certain. I think that my anecdotal experience is that's certainly true, and those faculty members are never going to be enough to create the culture change that we need. So it's very important that departments embrace this as an overarching goal and responsibility, as opposed to, oh, well, we'll hire a couple of underrepresented minority faculty. They'll take care of all this. That is not a viable solution. Okay, we need to move on. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Meg Urey. Meg is the Israel Munson Professor of Physics at Yale University, former chair of the department, and past president of the American Astronomical Society. And she's going to speak today about efforts by the American Astronomical Society to a number of efforts to further diversity and inclusive excellence within the American Astronomical Society. Meg?
Thanks a lot, Mary. So here's my screen. I was president of the American Astronomical Society from 2014 to 2016. And one of my two major goals was to work on equity and inclusion in the profession. But in the end, I ended up being sort of surfed over by events more than plans. To give you an example, hold on, it's not letting me go. Okay, sorry, I'm going to stop share and reshare. It's having trouble with advancing this. 1 second. Okay, let's do that again. And share.
I was having that same trouble, Meg.
Yeah. Okay. It worked the other day, so I'm just going to assume it's going to work today. Okay, let's try that. Nope, it's unhappy. Hold on.
Meg, you may have to put your mouse in the other window.
Yeah, you need to be in PowerPoint. Your mouse needs to be in PowerPoint, not Zoom.
The trouble is, yeah, it was actually, but I'm trying now. Hang on, here we go. Because I need to do this to share, and then I got to go back and put it there. Okay, let's try that again. Okay, I think you can see that slide now. This is just an illustration of one of the kind of unexpected events. In 2014 October, European Space Agency Rosetta mission landed a spacecraft on a comet. And this guy, the project scientist, showed up for the live TV activities wearing a shirt that is less than desirable, I would say, in a profession that's trying to welcome women. So the Twitterverse exploded. Our members were very upset. Our committees wanted us to make a statement, and we ended up doing that in conjunction with the Canadians and the Brits, following on some work that had already been done by the Australians. There were other similar events. Sorry about this. I'm just gonna do it brute force. I'm trying to move these windows around so that it doesn't happen again, but I'm not having a lot of success. Okay.
Someone gave a suggestion to me that there's arrows at the lower left that you might try.
Okay, thank you. So are you seeing my slide now? No?
Now we are.
Yes,
Okay.
we are, and you were
yeah.
successful in advancing it.
Okay,
great. Okay, so some other events that happened. Indiana passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which we were about to have a meeting in Indianapolis. This law essentially allows people to discriminate against the LGBT community and others. Again, our members came and said, what are you going to do about this? And we responded. Not long after, protesters blocked those construction crews from going to the summit of Mauna Kea for the 30-meter telescope, and that was a huge controversy, actually, because some senior faculty involved in the sent some emails that were very poorly worded, to say the least. So again, we were asked to take action, and I think these and many others were, these are occasions for discussions. Maybe the biggest brouhaha was in that fall. Berkeley professor Jeff Marcy emailed me to ask if we would publish his public apology. He had apologizing for having inadvertently offended women over the years as he harassed them. I found out later that BuzzFeed had given him 48 hours warning, and he had quickly responded by setting up an apology page and asking us to propagate it for him, which in the end we didn't do. Within a week, he had resigned under pressure from other astronomers, I think. And again, a huge discussion within the society. For the rest of my time as president, I was approached by young women at every meeting, at every opportunity, telling me about their experiences being harassed in our profession, and how they had to change fields or schools or advisors or whatever. So all of these had an impact, and we responded. I'll give you some examples, and I would say one of the biggest impacts has been on our meetings. We always had a code of conduct since 2008, so for a long time, but people didn't really know about it and hadn't read it, hadn't responded to it. So we added a checkoff box, so when you register for a meeting, you have to check off that you've read it. We put signs with the policy everywhere in the documentation, etc. We made it easier to report harassment. We hired an outside human resources firm to investigate complaints, which, by the way, once people knew about the opportunity to report problems, there were more reports, as you might expect. We also started we didn't start it. We have an interesting activity called Astronomy Allies, which was created by some of our members. They came to us asking for us to implement it at meetings. The idea was that a vetted set of would support people in the meeting who felt they were being harassed, stalked, bothered. And the idea was you could text, call, or email them, and they would come and rescue you, either sirens on or sirens off, meaning visibly taking you away from the problem person, or giving an excuse like, hey, we're late, we got to go to this meeting. So it wouldn't betray that you had asked for help. it's been incredibly successful. It's very popular. The group has grown. The requests have grown. I think it's being implemented other places now. And we kept it outside of the society. This is a detail, but maybe useful for other member societies. By not making it an official AAS activity, they don't have a Title IX reporting responsibility. And that puts the power in the hands of the people who are asking for help. They're free to complain, make a complaint to us, which we would be happy to deal with. But it also gives them an opportunity of just getting the problem to go away and then not having to deal with it further. We did a lot to enhance the welcoming nature of our meetings. There are reserved seats for people with disabilities. We've for a long time, for many years, we've been training session chairs. In fact, Paula Scotty had a lot to do with implementing that, among other things, to prevent bullying by audience members asking questions. When the Marcy thing erupted, people emailed me. I have like 1,000 emails from that period, asking me to throw the bum out, get rid of sexual harassers, take away their membership, which frankly, more people let their membership lapse than we throw out. We don't throw anybody out. But anyway, I went and looked at what do our bylaws say? What did our code of ethics say? Our code of ethics was a very short 2-page document that mainly talked about plagiarism and faking your data. And it had absolutely no process for dealing with violations of the code of ethics. So I asked 2 vice presidents and senior astronomer to quickly work on a revised code of ethics, which they did a marvelous job of, and we approved it the following June. And it's now very detailed. In general, we leave the enforcement of code of ethics to the responsible institution. In other words, if there's a professor misbehaving somewhere, his or her university has the responsibility to deal with it. In general, as a professional society, we don't have the tools or the power to find out information, but it leaves a path for unusual cases where the institutions aren't dealing with it or whatever, that we can take responsibility. As I said, these events were all sort of excuses for conversations, which helped lead toward the kind of change that Ed and Mary were talking about. We had a sexual harassment town hall just following the Marcy business. And by the way, it wasn't just Jeff Marcy. There were several other very high profile cases, including an astronomer at Caltech, and these were all known in the community. We also had a town hall on racism the following year, and these were attended by a very large fraction of the membership who were at the meeting. I mean, thousands of people, and they engendered a lot of conversations. So I feel like it was a vehicle for starting change. We did other things, the statement on the GRE and how it's racist and sexist, and one should be careful in using it as an admission criterion. A lot of these were brought to us, most of these issues were discussed with and brought to us by our diversity committees, which I list here. I won't say more about them, just to say that this is the kind of I've forgotten the term that Ed used, but it's the grassroots plus the leadership working together to try to make change. At the beginning, activities in service of equity and inclusion were really done by individuals. And one of the cataclysmic events was Margaret Burbage, famous astronomer, refusing to accept the Annie Jump Cannon Award in 1971 because she felt women should be getting the other awards, not just the one reserved for only women. That led to the creation of the CSWA. You see other activities here I've listed. The seminal 1992 Women in Astronomy meeting, which led to the Baltimore Charter. There have been additional meetings that in 2003, 2009, which also led to recommendations, and those morphed into what's now called inclusive astronomy. We already broadened it in 2003 to talk about other categories of disadvantage, of exclusion, but now making that explicit inclusive astronomy in 2015 and 2019. And I should say that although the committees for the LGBTQ community and a group on accessibility and disability are fairly recent, these groups essentially were discussed and fostered informally for decades. These are some links to some of those activities. What's changed, and this is my last slide, is that now these activities have become the responsibility, and it's been accepted as a responsibility of the profession. As the 2018 NRC report on sexual harassment said, academia is the worst environment apart from the military for sexual harassment and presumably other kinds of disrespecting minority populations. It's important to incorporate these issues into the broader term research misconduct, as the NSF has recently done, thanks to France Cordova, who asked that any PIs who have been found to have committed sexual misconduct have to be reported to the NSF, just as people who've misused data or done the previous definition of research misconduct. So we've come to, at least in this astronomical society, and I've seen the evolution happen over the last 30 years, it went from being a problem that those women or those people of color should go work on to a problem that we all own and we all need to work on. That doesn't mean we're there, not by any means, but it's a shared responsibility. Our bylaw says that we are committed to the philosophy of equality and of opportunity and treatment for all members, regardless of any reason other than scientific merit. So that's the charge we now own, and I think we will continue to work on for some time. And I leave the links here show our codes of ethic and anti-harassment policy. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Meg. We're going to go right to our next speaker, and then after Susan speaks, we'll have another question and answer period.
Oh, I have to stop share. Hang on. There we go.
Oh, okay. So it's my pleasure to introduce Susan Elrod. Susan is the chancellor at Indiana University South Bend campus and is a renowned expert in change management, has done a lot of work with Adrian Kazar, who Ed spoke about earlier. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Susan.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation to join you today. I've heard these talks as we prepared, and I've enjoyed hearing them again. And what I hope to do is provide some broad perspective and some ways for you to think about leadership and systemic change and how you might help your society members and institutions move some of this forward to achieve the objectives that we've been talking about. So I'm going to now share my screen and hope this all works. Let me just get the slideshow going. Is that working? All
Yes.
right. So this slide just is an oversimplification of what we've just been talking about. Students are excited about physics, astronomy in Meg's case, and they come to our institutions. Oops, sorry, let me get back here. Have experiences, and these experiences determine whether or not they succeed or don't, whether they graduate or don't, whether they stay in the major or don't. And a lot of these experiences, of course, are informed by their own experiences. But I think the point here is, while they're at our institutions, we have an opportunity to help them from where they are get to where they want to go if we focus on the students. So I think this next slide just shows, which we already heard from Mary, an example of the goals that have been set out in the Team Up report, but that are examples of the kinds of goals that are in other reports, obviously specifically the Team Up report, fostering a sense of belonging, all of these kinds of things that we've been talking about. So these are the kinds of actions and outcomes that can be instituted at our universities and colleges to help students be more successful. In order to influence these kinds of outcomes, leaders, really, and everyone who's trying to make these changes has to operate and understand the entire system of higher education. So this slide is taken from a report from the American Association of Universities referencing a prior publication. And it just shows from the individual faculty member at the center to then out to the department or various groups of faculty, out to the broader scope of the institution, and then even into the external realm. Here it specifies accreditors, consortia, or systems, but societies may see themselves in that outer circle as part of the system operating within higher education. So as we're thinking about the changes in the Team Up report, for example, or even the kinds of things that Meg talked about happening in the contexts there, leaders have to understand the entire system of higher education, and in particular, if we're focusing on institutional change, what are the layers and the levels at which we can pull various levers that might help us think about change. So here I'm just showing again, Ed showed this table, and it's in the Team Up report. And this is complex, this table. And the point I want to make about it is with these circles, I just circled a few of these that to me really show that in order to take any of these seriously or manage the change, like alignment with related efforts, ongoing data collection, coming up with incentives and rewards, we really need to be thinking across institutions, across units, departments, from academic affairs to student affairs. And so this means a systemic approach is required. We have to understand the entire elephant. And I think probably many of you, if not everyone, is familiar with this parable of the blind monks examining the elephant. So each monk feels its section of the elephant and has a different interpretation. It's like a snake, it's like a wall. But we have to all come together and make sure everyone understands, not just the leaders understand how the whole system works, but everyone needs to understand the interconnections that make up the whole elephant, or in this case, the college or the university. So what does it really mean to talk about systemic change? So from my perspective that I've generated over the years working with Adriana on various projects and working with dozens of colleges and universities across the country, this is change that affects multiple courses, departments, programs, even divisions, again, academic across to student affairs, maybe across different colleges, depending on how institutions are organized, and change that results in changes that affect policies, procedures, norms, cultures, and or structures. And these structures could be curricular, they could be fiscal, they could be organizational. So this is the sort of a little more detail on the second order change that Ed mentioned earlier. It requires that leaders understand the system, as I've been mentioning, as well as its interacting parts, and then ultimately know how to pull levers that influence the system. It actually requires quite a sophisticated understanding of an institution. Now, certainly as the chancellor of a university, I have an understanding, for the most part, I don't know everything, of the parts of the institution and how they interact. But people in their faculty roles or department leadership roles may not have that understanding. And so I think figuring out ways for us to, and you as society leaders, to help your member institutions get that understanding and then how to operate within it is going to be critical in helping advance the Team Up report and other changes. And here's just one resource, a model for systemic institutional change that I published with Adriana now in 2016, and you can get it at AAC News website. In this report, we describe this model and how it might be used by campus teams or society leaders to help affect systemic change. I'm not going to talk about the details of this model except to say that we outline particular steps. It's shown, drawn kind of as a river because the process of change is not linear. You can eddy around obstacles, which are where those arrows are around rocks in the river, where you need to spend some time. For example, establishing a vision and lining that vision up with institutional priorities is critical. Critical in establishing that vision is understanding the data landscape of your institution. Too many change projects start, as Ed already referenced, with, hey, let's just do this, and magically change will occur. It turns out that what works at one institution may or may not work at another institution because the landscape is completely different. A commuter college versus a residential college, a private institution versus a large R1. All of those contexts are different. And so every change project must start with establishing a vision and understanding its own data landscape. Anyway, I could give and have given whole workshops on this model, and would be happy to continue that conversation for those that might be interested. So what is really required by campus change leaders? Again, trying to give you all some ideas and tools to help think about the levers that you have to pull to make these things happen. Institutions have to assess organizational strengths and weaknesses. They have to ensure distributed or shared leadership, as Ed already mentioned, and I'm going to spend a few minutes talking a little bit more about that. Evaluate framing and language for change. How is it talked about? Who's talking about it? And what are the change goals or talking points? Utilizing multiple theory-based strategies. Usually, a lot of people talk about what's your theory of change. There are actually multiple theories that may be appropriate to any one change project or any one institutional setting. And the approach that I've taken with campuses as I've worked with them over the years is to figure out what change theory or what change approach resonates with the people doing the change, and then using that to help them leverage a change process that's going to work for them. You have to create and assess a systems approach. It's kind of what we're talking about right now. And leveraging influence strategies. There's probably a whole seminar on this, but and I'm not going to talk much about it today, but one thing I've found as I've worked, especially with faculty leaders and groups trying to affect change, is they haven't thought enough about the political environment, meaning the little p politics environment, the power dynamics, who's an influencer without maybe being in a formal position. Are formal leaders actually influential? So thinking about that influential environment is really important, and developing strategies around it. Building and supporting networks, and then creating feedback loops for continued conversation. It can't just be a one-way flow. It has to be constantly evaluated. So these were taken actually from 2 publications that you can find on AAU's website. So that's the American Association of Universities, and their STEM initiative. They actually have several other publications, and I'm going to mention one more next. These are great resources if you have not already reviewed them. So I'm really only going to talk about the first 2 of these bullet points. I'll sort of obliquely reference the others as I finish up my talk. So the first is really assessing an organizational strengths and weaknesses. This publication from AAU called Essential Questions and Data Sources is a great one. It provides questions for institutional leaders to ask at every level of the university. So for example, institution-wide, how are measures of teaching excellence included in a meaningful way in annual and merit reviews, promotion and tenure processes for all instructors at the institution? So you could insert from teaching excellence, you could put diversity, equity, and inclusion goals here. You could think about this in all kinds of ways about what kinds of measures are actually being used as faculty are being reviewed for promotion and tenure at your institution or at your member institutions. At the school or college level, In what ways do deans use data on student progression, retention, and completion to inform discussions with department chairs and instructors to facilitate program involvement? Data is an important part of the conversation. It's not the only part of the conversation, but if leaders at institutions are not using the data to inform conversations and have conversations, faculty and others across the institution, first of all, won't know the data and won't understand how important the data is. So that's just an example of one of the questions in this guide. At the department level, what are the demographics of students in the department? What are the progression, retention, and completion rates for these students? How are they broken out? How do these compare with other departments? What steps are being taken to improve these rates? So again, getting into the data at every level. This guide also has sources of data for people to use and examine, like how can I get this data? Where is this information? How can I understand it better? And then at the course level, here's just another example of a question in this guide. To what extent does the instructor understand the biases that he or she may bring to the classroom, and what steps the instructor may have taken to mitigate these and ensure all students are succeeding? This speaks directly to the entire content of this session today. So again, a very useful resource for all of you to think about. So now switching more into the realm of leadership. Leadership is critical, and I'm going to talk just specifically about leadership on campuses, although your leadership as society leaders is also critical. So faculty leaders are central champions at the department and academic levels. They're the ones spending most of the time with students. They're the ones making the changes, implementing the changes in courses and programs. So they are critical. Chairs, deans, and provosts are needed to support policy changes, resource commitments, and other institutional and infrastructural supports. A lot of change efforts get stuck at the infrastructural level because we run into money barriers, or we run into process barriers, or we run into policies that are antithetical to the change that we're trying to make. Leadership is required at multiple levels and across the institution, including student affairs and other student support offices. So this is where shared leadership really comes into play. It comes into play all across what I'm illustrating here, but in particular, many academic departments either are unaware of or have forgotten about their entire student affairs division, which is doing things which have programs, which have supports for students, maybe first year experiences. Bringing those two divisions together is often extremely helpful in moving some of these outcomes forward like we've been talking about today. Senior leadership has to be on board to connect the change efforts to broader institutional priorities and advocate for and champion success. Every institution has a strategic plan, and so asking senior leaders and asking strategic planning committees and groups, where are these important outcomes around diversity, equity, and inclusion included? And are they even included? And if they are, how can departments connect their goals? How can these team-up goals get connected into institutional plans and efforts? It's one way to ensure that resources and effort will be committed to ensuring they achieve if strategic planning is actually implemented appropriately at campuses, on campuses. And then lastly, leadership development is critical. Too often we leave the development of leaders to ad hoc processes. Department chairs are put in place, elected. You know, it's your turn. What are we providing to leaders at the chair level, dean, associate dean, and other levels around these kinds of issues? And so I'll be talking a little bit more about some things that we're doing now to help with that. Hold on, I might have missed a slide. Well, anyway, I'll move on with this. Maybe I moved it. So just a little bit more on shared leadership. And you can read more in the publication reference there and referenced also by Ed. I'm also co-editing a book on shared leadership with Adriana and others to provide people with real tools and examples of what this looks like in higher ed. but it really just means that a greater number of people are involved in leadership. Follower and leader roles are often interchangeable in a shared leadership environment. I'm not always the one leading. It could be a faculty member who's leading a particular aspect of the change. It's a way to bring multiple perspectives and expertise to the table of leadership and change initiatives. And leadership is not necessarily based on position. And it ensures or promotes collaboration across the organization. As I've been just talking about, if we're going to understand and operate across the institution, we need to be collaborating across the institution. So models of shared leadership help make all these things happen. And I just want to show this table, and I'm not going to go through the details of it, but just to demonstrate that there's different ways you can enact a shared leadership model. You can establish co-leaders to help run an initiative, put a faculty chair and a dean in charge of something. And now you've got two different kinds of leaders coming together to lead a larger group on a change initiative. You might establish teams of leaders around an initiative, especially a very complex one where you have multiple aspects and you need teams then to be focused in. Our recent approach to responding to this virus, for example, on every campus and maybe in your institution, is a team-based approach. We have a team working on this, a team working on that. We have a larger team coordinating all the efforts. So many of us, by default of emergency planning efforts, are experiencing, okay, great, are experiencing shared leadership, hopefully. And then you can have a dispersed or distributed model of shared leadership. So again, not going to go into the details, but just to provide you with a little bit more information. So what we hope is happening in systemic change projects is really a system of leadership is at play. It's very ineffective to have just one person leading, if you will, by mandate or dictation. The most effective way is to bring everybody in, have a shared model, grassroots, grass tops, depending on how you think about it. So what we're doing is, and I'm just going to preview this, this is a model that's in development, and we're hoping to make resources available over the next several months. But what we've done, Adriana and I and my colleague Cynthia Bowerly have started to develop a model of systemic change leadership. So we have identified on the left of the slide the leadership context operating at play in institutions. So what are the goals of the change? What is the level or the locus or the scope of the change? What kind of institution are you operating in? And what are the internal and external factors that are influencing the institution? All of these contexts then have an influence on what leaders do. And so we're calling those leader moves. And in this case, showing three different kinds of leaders. And again, going back to the system, leaders are interacting. So provosts are doing things, deans are doing things. And our assertion is that they must be coordinated in a system. And we're a bunch of biologists. So we like to think about an ecosystem of leadership around these change initiatives. These leaders then do things that impact the levers for change. And so I've listed there a set of institutional levers that we've identified, from the largest, culture change, all the way down to very detailed aspects of how students experience the institution, cost, financial aid, employment, how they register for classes, transactional barriers. And again, the idea is if all these things happen well and in a coordinated manner, we get the systemic change outcomes that we have been talking about. So we are in the process of then identifying, really illuminating the black box of change leader moves. So we've identified 7 categories that some are familiar in terms of just leadership, but we think we've identified some very nuanced aspects, and we're working on the development of resources and workshops based on this model that we've been developing. And I just want to close with what you all can do for your members. You know all of these, but I just thought I'd put them up here on one slide. So what can associations and societies do? And Meg's presentation was a brilliant illustration of many of these. I'm not necessarily going to go through this list, but just to remind you all that what you say and do has an influence. And again, refer back to those resources that I mentioned from AAU and others to think more about the role you can play in helping make these changes happen. And with that, I will close.
Thank you so much, Susan. Now we're going to start our second question and answer period. So these are questions directed specifically at Meg's and Susan's talks. And then after this session, we'll go into a broader discussion with all the panelists. So Arlene, can you
absolutely
help us
sure.
out?
Yes, Chick has a question, I think mostly for Meg. So Chick, I invite you to voice your question.
So my question had to deal with the role and management of social media in dealing with these issues, and what are some best practices that could be used when deliberative discussions need to take place in order to properly react to issues that come up that have meaningful impact?
Yeah. So things move very quickly on social media. I was on Twitter when I was president. I'm not any longer, but I think people want an answer today, yesterday, 5 minutes ago. And often it takes time to build consensus. So it's really attention. I mean, I don't know that I have the perfect answer. It's really attention to try to respond both accurately in terms of reflecting what the membership might as a whole feel, or what the Board of Trustees feels should be done, and reacting quickly. So I think this is where a statement of one's values can be very handy. If you have in place things like previous statements, you've established trust in some way, then these things go much better. And the more antagonistic the environment, the less people feel supported, the more it can escalate into a pretty big conflict. So I don't have a perfect answer. I wish Twitter would evaporate completely. But I'm an old person who doesn't get to dictate that, and most of our activists thought that their daily tweeting was changing the world for the better. So you have to accept that. You have to, listen to the people, right? So you have to accept that they feel they're really achieving something, and you have to meet them where they are. You have to respond where they are. In that respect, I'll just say our committees were very, very helpful. I kept in close touch with the chairs of the committees and had some sessions with the committee as a whole. And that the more you actually talk to people as opposed to write at people, the better.
Oh, great. Thank you, Meg. Rachel, please ask your question.
Rachel, are you muted?
Yeah, now I'm not. So I was wondering if Susan has any specific ideas on how professional societies can work with universities to bring about the kind of systemic change that you were talking about.
Mm-hmm. So I think AAU is a great example. They mounted, it's a very comprehensive example, and they had millions of dollars of National Science Foundation funding and others behind them. So if you go to AAU's website, the American Association of Universities, and you go look under education and find their STEM initiative, you'll find a plethora of things that they did, and the reports that I previewed for you in this talk are great examples. Adriana Kezar also published an article, which I didn't reference, and I think that Liz, I sent the reference to that, or I can send it again, which basically outlines how networks, how external networks function to promote change. So I think there are a number of publications, reports, and resources that you can use to see what they've done and then figure out what might make sense in your own context. So again, I'm happy to work with Liz and others at AIP to get a concise listing of those resources. that you all can access.
Thank you. That would be great, especially the reference to the article that you just mentioned on networks.
Mm-hmm. Right. Thank you, Susan. Michael, you had a question for Meg?
Yeah, thanks, Arlene. And actually, there's sort of two linked questions, one for Meg and one for Susan. So I'm going to ask them both if I can. And one is, for Susan, in your work, have you seen an example of a society in biology or elsewhere that has really demonstrated impactful leadership about changing a community's sense of shared leadership in and around diversity? And Meg, it's sort of similar question to you with regard to AAS and the astronomy astrophysics community. I mean, it's well recognized that astronomy and astrophysics has been really successful at moving the needle on gender diversity, in particular in the astronomy community. And is there some sort of secret sauce that the astronomers were able to find that actually got that sense of shared leadership amongst the astronomy community? So they're sort of linked questions for Susan and for Meg.
Meg, do you want to go first, or do you want me to?
I was going to tell you to go first.
Thanks for your question. On this, I'm just going to focus in on the topic of shared leadership. It's a relatively, it's not necessarily a new idea, but it's starting to take hold more and more. So it's new in its implementation. So a lot of leaders are not using it, don't know what it is, aren't comfortable with it. As a leader myself, who implements shared leadership regularly, it requires you to let go of some things, right? So there's a whole leadership development aspect to helping leaders, especially formal leaders, people in positions, adopt or move into a shared leadership environment. I am not familiar with any scientific societies that have developed a set of workshops or resources to help institutional leaders move in this direction, but that would be tremendously useful. So the book that we're co-editing, we're hoping provides some of that guidance. And I've done some conference presentations and workshops on it. It's a real mind shift for people. So I think exploring that, having AIP do that would be, and your member societies and organizations would really be great.
So for astronomy, let me go back to your specific question. I think we have a couple of advantages that made it possible for us to move, and that was mainly that we're smallish. The American Physical Society has upwards of 50,000 members. We have, under 10,000, and it used to be even smaller than that. So I think it allows us, a lot of us, to know each other and to talk to each other. Then, of course, we had maybe the biggest sexual harassment scandal breaking early. That also galvanized a lot of activity. And I'll say that without knowing anything about the theories of shared leadership or other theories of change, we kind of backed into doing some of these things. The American Geophysical Union convened a bunch of societies to talk about creating codes of ethics. We had just rewritten ours, so we presented that as a some kind of model. But having everybody in the room talking about what the pluses and minuses were, I think was useful. Last thing I'll say is we kind of dance around the real problem here, which is that the reason people don't want to change is mainly because they think they're perfect already. And the more perfect they think they are, the less they're like change. So in particular, physicists think they're, some of the smartest people on the planet, and that their profession is already super good, and any change to that profession is basically a drop in quality. So that's the fundamental difficulty that we have to just over and over again talk about how the way to think about this is that by concentrating on a third of the population, the white males, we are basically lowering our quality. But you know, you have to say that hundreds of times before it sinks in. And I'll just say, I think the professions that are the snobbiest, that is the most satisfied, and the universities that think they're the best, the highest ranked universities, are usually the ones that are most difficult to change because they think they're already perfect.
So on that note, since we're just about out of time for this Q&A, we're going to move on to the panel discussion. And so now we'd ask all the participants to feel free to write into the chat for questions for any of the speakers or on and on any of the topics that you've heard today. Arlene, do we already have some questions in the queue, or if
we have some questions that we didn't ask from the first session, some from the second, and then I'm sure people will ask questions as we have the discussion.
Okay. I want to just pick up on Meg's point there for one instant before we start the questions, which is to say, and this has come up a couple of times. There's the idea that you know, the way we do physics and the way we're organized to do physics is already perfect. So why would we want to change anything? The second is, so there's certainly that attitude, and there's also the attitude that physicists in physics communities are like fish swimming in water. They don't even notice the water. And so I think it's helpful. I mean, one of the things we have to do with our colleagues or for our colleagues is to help them understand that what feels completely natural is actually a system and a structure. And that, so I think the invisible system is the first hurdle. I love a quote that I couldn't find the actual author, but it seems to be ascribed to the British healthcare system, that every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. Seems almost like a tautology, but not quite, right? And the reason the British healthcare system was interested in this idea was presumably their goal was to have sick people become healthy. And they examined their system, and what they found was that they took sick people and they diagnosed them, and then they came up with a treatment plan for the perfectly compliant patient. And then when patients were unable to be perfectly compliant patients, they then blamed the patients for their lack of compliance. So the system they actually had was they took sick people and they remained sick people because they weren't able to comply. And then the healthcare system blamed the patients. So they had a system that was perfectly designed to have sick patients who have been blamed rather than well patients. And so when they looked at that as a system, they were able to see that where we need to concentrate is, why is it that people can't comply? And so if you've had a friend or relative who's had cancer in the last 20 years, say, since this system went into place, and they have to have radiation therapy every day for 40 days, the first question the providers ask is, do you have transportation? And if you don't have transportation, there's an army of volunteers that the American Cancer Society set up to get the patient to radiation. That's a very different system from come to radiation for 40 days in a row. And then when you don't come, you're responsible for your lack of response, for the lack of improvement in your cancer. So as physicists, we're in that first set. Students who don't persist, we blame the student. And we're not looking at our system. And so just even sharing that anecdote with your colleagues can be a helpful way of helping them start to sort of see things differently. Okay, I'll give it back over to Arlene.
Right. There's such great discussion going on in the chat. I encourage you all to take a look too. Tyrone Porter, you had a question around social scientists at meetings, so please ask your question.
Yeah, I'm curious to what extent social scientists have been engaged and involved. This is brought up, I think, in one of the earlier presentations. It might have been from Ed, that, you know, to think we as physical scientists and biological scientists, we don't necessarily think as social scientists. And so a lot of the conversation and what's in this report seems to be much more from a social scientist perspective. And so are they actively engaged and involved at society meetings, at the universities, things that maybe you're aware of? Because my sense is that's what's really going to be important to help sort of push this forward.
Well, they were certainly a key part of the Team Up report. So we had a number of social scientists who are experts. Actually, their research is on essentially the sociology or the organizational structure of science, and even physics in particular. Ed, do you want to say some more about this?
Well, only that from my perspective, we don't do it enough. We tend to invite social scientists to specialty meetings like Women in Astronomy or Inclusive Astronomy. I'm very grateful for AIP Statistical Research Center under Rachel Ivy's leadership to always show up in strength for those things. But it doesn't permeate our organizations. And I believe if we really want to make progress, we should change that. And that's where professional societies can help, because they can organize sessions like this, but maybe even more importantly, attach some value. And we all know how we attach value to things in our professional societies. Look where the money and the awards go, and the prize talks, the invited talks.
Can I just add something that, many of the people on this call have learned a huge amount from social scientists, but most physicists that in my experience tend to disregard anything social scientists say. I'll give you one or two examples of where they have been really critical. The Space Telescope Science Institute studied their proposal review process. This is very, very important because it not only dictates who gets to use the Hubble telescope, which is, data for your work, but also a huge amount of funding that follows that observing time. And it was discovered that their process is biased against senior women in particular, that they have about half as much chance of getting a proposal accepted as the average user. And they tried many different things to address this. And one of the most effective was to invite social scientists to come and sit in on the proposal review. In the end, they've ended up anonymizing the proposals, taking out all identifying information. And NASA as a whole, NASA Astrophysics, is following this model. All proposals will now be anonymized. But STSCI also included social scientists in the discussion to make sure that the discussion focused on the merits of the proposal and not the identity of the proposers. So that's just one tiny example, but it's a kind of partnership that I think has promise. And if we could think about how to do that, how to partner with social scientists in trying to achieve some of our goals here, I think that'd be really valuable.
Maybe this is something AIP could play a role. A prominent role.
If I could just chime in here, I think the national academies are providing some leadership here. The Board on Science Education has convened a roundtable on undergraduate STEM education. So this is more broadly, and you can go to their website and see obviously their reports and activities, but that roundtable has social scientists on it. So Ann Austin in particular is co-chair of the roundtable, and she's done tremendous work. And she's not a scientist. She comes from the education and social science side of things. Adriana Kizar is a social and education scientist. So that's why I like working with her so much, because she brings that perspective to my own scientific background, but then also my practical leadership approach that I take as I do this work. So I think there are some good examples of social scientists being involved, but I agree that they should be more involved and we should be including them. And it'd be great, again, in the world of physics and physicists, to deliberately engage them. And I think this session this morning is a good example of how AIP is already taking a leadership role.
Absolutely. So I think this discussion is sort of reflected in some of Susan Avery's question on systems thinking. So Susan, would you like to ask your question? Are you still there?
Yeah, there we go. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes indeed.
No, I've really found this session to be very exciting. Thank you both, Meg and Susan, because it gets to the problem that I've been dealing with for probably the last part of my career, and that is that the problems that we're looking at are systems problems, and it requires the systems thinking. Yet our structure in the university, the way we teach, the way we do our research is not systems oriented, unless you happen to be an ecosystem person. But even as you study the ocean, the ecosystem is related to the physical system as well. So I'm just wondering, do we just have a set of people in universities and our education frameworks who are unable to think in a systems approach? And how do we get down to the point where we allow this sort of systems thinking to really emerge right from the ground state of teaching to the research that we do, to the way we structure ourselves, to the groups that we have. It just seems that we lack that capacity in our university environments. And unless you get to a leadership role, and in a leadership role, you do have to have that systems thinking approach. So I appreciate the comments and this discussion that we've been having here. Thank you.
Well, I'm happy to kick it off and others can chime in, but I'm not sure I would agree that people are reluctant to take a systems view. I think people just have not done it for a number of reasons. And I think one place it starts is in our promotion and tenure a whole system. We've encouraged people to, through that process, take an insular view of their work. Actually, recently in the Change magazine, I published an article with colleagues around a new idea. So you all might be familiar with Boyer's categories of scholarship. So we've proposed a new one called the Scholarship of Mission. And so many faculty are doing things that could be deemed scholarship that have to do with advancing institutional goals like those that we're talking about here today. So one change might be to broaden how we even imagine faculty work and include these kinds of systemic changes in tenure and promotion. So, I think it's just we have not had the systems in place to help people see. So going back to that shared leadership approach, a lot of work has to be done to help people see the system, understand it, be comfortable working within it. And it's one of the reasons why we're developing that model of systemic change leadership, so that we can start to develop the tools to help leaders understand the system, figure out how to work within it, know that they don't have to do all of it themselves, but that they should enlist a core of leaders across the campus to pull levers at different places. Maybe they should even know what their specific role is. So as dean, here's the 3 things you need to do. Faculty leaders, here are the 3 things you need to do. President, here's what you need to do, so that we're all coordinated across the institution. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Okay, we have about 15 minutes left together. So I'm going to ask Arlene, are there questions that I'm specifically interested in? The opening questions, which were, what levers for change does your society have to enable culture change in your discipline? How could your society begin to pull these levers to address your inclusive excellence goals? And what successes have you had? So if you have questions or comments related to those, one thing we've been talking about pretty big ideas today. And what I don't want anyone to leave the session with is the feeling that, oh, these things are so big, there's nothing I can do, or there's nothing we can do. So I'd like everyone to be able to leave the session with a sense of, as a society leader, how are you going to continue this conversation within your society? And what support do you need to do that? in particular from AIP. So Arlene?
There haven't been any questions around that, no, but we heard a lot from Meg. There are lots of levers there that were pulled. So I'm wondering if anyone else has any sort of smaller or bigger successes around making changes as a professional society leader.
Okay, so while people type those in, perhaps you can go ahead with some of the other questions that people ask.
Right. So there was, unfortunately, John Hain had to leave, but he had a question earlier, and I'm trying to find it, around how emotional intelligence plays into, let's see, what role, this is to all of the speakers, what role does emotional intelligence play in all you've been working on?
Maybe I'll take that one because I typed a response into that. It plays a huge role, obviously. Empathy is the basis of human connection. Change is all about human connection and relationships.
Mm-hmm.
That's a term that may be a little bit like the screeching fingernails on the blackboard to the physicists, but I think we just have to remind physicists that those are old days. We've moved now to whiteboards. If you want to have a good framework for thinking about the roles of empathy, hope, and compassion, I highly recommend books by Dick Boyatzis and his collaborators. He is at Case Western's Weatherhead School, their business school. In particular, Primal Leadership by Daniel Goleman, Boyatzis and Annie McKee, and Resonant Leadership, which has a great work manual by Boyatzis and McKee. Those should be on all of your reading lists and your students' reading lists.
Yeah, I guess I would add, if you just, for physicists who might be terrified of terms like empathy, compassion, another way to put it is to lead with inquiry. That is, so you're having an interaction with a student. And we've said the team up report is very clear that faculty interactions with students are enormous in helping to help students have a sense of belonging, a sense of physics identity, and a general impression that people want them to succeed. One thing that we can do, kind of a practical thing we can help our colleagues with, is to say, to always start an advising session or office hour session by leading with inquiry. And what that means is what you're going to do, you're interested in, is finding out what's going on with the student. So it's not about you, it's about them. So there's a very practical hands-on thing they can do. And the shift in attitude is that you need them to tell you what's going on, that you can't do your job well if you don't know what's going on with, so they are the data. And physicists, they're the data. So you're mining the data before you respond. So that's, if people are allergic to empathy and compassion, that kind of thing, then approach it from that perspective.
I guess I would add that I think a lot of people in universities are quite empathetic. It's just that it's not their top priority. We've been dancing around this question of excellence. Now, there's no need to compromise excellence to create diversity. I mean, everybody knows that, but I think many of our colleagues feel there is, that they are unaware of bias in the measurement of merit. I don't think there's anything wrong with a meritocracy per se, that is, as a principle, but there is in the operation of it. There is bias in how we evaluate people. And some people are aware of that, some are not. And certainly if you're not aware of it, then it doesn't matter how empathetic you are, if you just feel your student is not a success. So we need a mind shift where people, try somehow to recognize the lack of objectivity in our current systems. I think that's really hard for most of our colleagues. And I think this is where professional societies could really play a role by having, for example, a plenary speaker once a year who talks about experiments showing, current experiments showing how bias impacts what we think of people. At the National Academy meeting last spring, there were some great talks. There was a great session on this. I think that could have an impact.
And if I could just add one quick follow-up statement, I would agree that there are many people at institutions of higher learning who are who will say they care about students, they care about their outcomes, but they care about them from their point of view. We have a lot of people who start to implement things because they think that's what students need, when they've not done what Mary so eloquently outlined and asked the students. And then though we're open to hear what the students had to say. So I think there's a lot of resonance here. And I think helping faculty, chairs, even deans and other leaders be open to the student experience. And what that does, what it means to do that is you have to set yourself aside. I tell people all the time, one of the first tenets of good leadership is it's not about you. And I think Mary already said that. It's not about you. It is about the people that you're leading. It is about the students in your classroom. And you have to figure out how to get over yourself and get into their experience.
Amen.
Yeah, another way this shows up is that, you know, working with my colleagues on this, is that we think if a student comes to our office or even doesn't come to our office, we think of ourselves as very welcoming. You know, that what could possibly be the barrier? And it's like, well, first of all, I remind them of their mother. You know, I'm not their cool big sister anymore. And an authority figure, and I'm a dean now, and I still have academic advisees. It's a huge hurdle just to walk across the threshold. So I need to think that I may feel like a very accessible, welcoming person, but that's not necessarily the impression I give to an 18-year-old student 3 months out of high school. So I need to think about not what I see or feel inside, but what they see, and how I can break down the barriers to make actual access.
I might just add that what I heard from Susan Avery is sometimes described as the curse of gradualism. And that when you have a crisis, well, the financial folks tell us never fail to take advantage of a crisis. This is often the best time when you can have candid conversations with people and check in about, really, what is your experience like? No, don't hide your vulnerability. We're all vulnerable now. We have to step back and start thinking about a bigger system than our classroom, our campus, and our profession. Take advantage of the times.
I couldn't agree more, Ed. And Meg, thank you for actually bringing up the issue of meritocracy and excellence, because that was a big topic here in the chat. So I appreciate that. I think we have a few more minutes. So I have a question from Efrain Rodriguez. Who'd like to unmute?
So just Arlene, we may want to wrap up soon because we're only 3 minutes from 12:15. I want to be respectful of people's time. But Efrain, go ahead.
Yes, my question was very briefly about awards and how AIP can help us sort of diversify committees at awards committees, because I feel like awards and honors do play a big role in tenure and promotion, and getting, you know, getting sort of recognized by respective professional societies is very important for not just universities, but national level as well. So I was just wondering, what role can AIP play?
Could I take that briefly, very briefly? In my experience, the data show that the choke point is nominations aren't happening, not that the committees are not behaving in a fair way, although that may also be true, but it's a secondary effect. It's the nominations of diverse populations are not happening. So that's where we have to, that's the thing we have to fix.
people have to be tapped. So
yeah, and you can also ask for someone to nominate you.
Yes. So I agree 100% with Meg. You need to figure out how to get the people nominating people of color, underrepresented minorities, etc. But you've also got to help those individuals gain the confidence to step up. So I think it's both. Yeah.
Thank you.
Anyone else have anything to add? Okay.
This is Brian Toby from the EPA. I was just going to add very quickly that what we've done is we've actually set up a committee specifically to look for people who might not be nominating themselves or pushing their own, candidacy for a award or for nomination as a fellow. And it's too early to say how this will work, but it's certainly something that we found shows promise.
So I'm sorry. I just wanted to add, if I could, to Susan's point.
Sure, quick comment.
Yeah, so gotcha. This is like just 30 seconds. So as Ed knows, I'm part of this Northeast Faculty Leadership Program, and actually Susan's point, which is people have to be nominated and recognized, but also marginalized people, underrepresented groups have to also step forward. And we actually had a session as part of our training to be future leaders on making sure we're noticed, making sure that we step forward, making sure that we take risks, so that we can be made more aware to people who are currently in leadership positions, because apparently that's how this all happens. If you want to actually have a leadership role or a leadership position, usually people nominate you, they take note of who you are, and they oftentimes might even ask you or invite you to apply for certain things. It doesn't happen if you're just sitting back in the wings. And so it does have to be a two-part process. I agree with that 100%.
Sorry, it's 3 seconds. AAS has made all prizes self-nominating. That is, you can self-nominate or you can nominate someone else, but they all look like self-nominations. So they're open to everybody.
And the nomination process has to be transparent. I think that is the end of our question.
I would make the comment that that's not enough.
No, it's not. It's a start.
It's a start, but it's not enough because very often people don't view themselves necessarily.
Exactly. That was the previous remark. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was Tyrone's point. So we are at 12:15, 11:15, 10:15, and 9:15, depending on where you're dialing in from. And so, Michael, did you want to give some closing remarks?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I want to thank everybody for joining us this morning. Notwithstanding a few technical hiccups along the way, I thought this was a fantastic discussion, and notwithstanding again how disruptive sometimes being online can be. So thank you to everybody for joining us. I hope, as Mary mentioned at the beginning, that the society leaders around the table have walked away with some thoughts about first steps they can take in and around these ideas. I've got to say that for me, some of the ideas around shared leadership I thought were really interesting, and I want to learn a lot more, Susan, about and looking forward to your upcoming book, etc. on that. So thank you for that. But I also want to thank Mary, Ed, Meg, and Susan for being on the panel today. This was one of, I think, a whole series of events that AIP will be engaged in the future, not just on the Team Up report, but around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. As I mentioned at the beginning, it's a key element of our strategic framework going forward. And I know from sitting with leaders from all the 10 member societies and the affiliated societies that it's a key priority for all the societies that are here today. So we're committed at AIP to being a partner in those discussions, to providing channels where member societies can both share ideas and learn from each other. And where appropriate, we will certainly help with the implementation of priorities going forward. So happy for all of you to provide feedback to us after this meeting. And hopefully we'll be able to have both virtual and in-person meetings on these issues soon and going forward. So if you have information, there will be an email message that we'll send you after this session. Liz in the chat mentioned that we will be recording a lot of the various books and other resources that were mentioned in the chat to try and ensure that everybody has a record of those. So we'll share those. And you can also just reply to the email that we'll send out afterwards if you have any feedback. So thank you again so much. If I don't know if we can do a virtual round of applause, but thank you very much to everybody. And I look forward to seeing you all again soon, both in person and online.